The morning started like any other at the sprawling Brentwood estate, sun glinting off the manicured lawns, birds chirping in a rhythm that seemed almost too perfect for the horrors that would soon unfold. But inside, behind the walls of opulence and carefully curated privacy, a storm had been quietly gathering for decades, a storm that no one, not even the closest family members, could see clearly enough to stop. It was the kind of tragedy that makes you question everything you think you know about fame, family, and the hidden fractures that lie beneath the surface of even the most celebrated lives. But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. Imagine this. The man who had made millions of people laugh, who had shaped American comedy for generations, Mel Brooks, leaning close to Rob Reiner in a private moment and saying words no one could forget. "You're walking a path I wouldn't wish on anyone. It ends in tears, or worse." Just think about that for a second. Not a joke, not a quip, not the casual advice of an elder, but a warning, a desperate, almost premonitory warning. How often do we get moments like that in life? Moments where someone sees the edge before we do and tries to pull us back. How often do we ignore them? That warning, as surreal and haunting as it sounds, was only the beginning. Because just days ago, the world was shaken by news that almost seemed like it could only exist in fiction. Rob Reiner, 78, and his wife Michelle, 70, were found stabbed to death in their $13.5 million Brentwood home, a place that had been a sanctuary, a playground, and a haven from the relentless glare of fame. The discovery was made by their daughter, Romy, 27, who had walked into a scene that no one should ever have to witness. In the same breath that she described the horror, she pointed to a family member, a son and brother, who she feared might be responsible. That's right, in the heart of Hollywood, in a family whose names are synonymous with laughter and legacy, blood had spilled at the hands of someone who should have loved them. And yet, the tragedy wasn't entirely unforeseen. Beneath the smiles, the red carpet moments, and the carefully curated public appearances, there were warning signs, subtle yet profound. Family sources spoke of Nick, 32, Rob and Michelle's son, and the pressures and contradictions that had shaped him from a young age. He was described as entitled, someone who wanted the life, love, and social acceptance that came so naturally to his famous parents, without the effort or the work that built their legacy. Isn't that a story we recognize in 1,000 ways? The pressure to succeed, the weight of expectation, the resentment that builds quietly when someone feels invisible in a household defined by celebrity. But in this case, those pressures escalated to an unimaginable breaking point. Growing up as the child of Rob Reiner and the grandson of Carl Reiner is, to put it mildly, a unique experience. For Nick, it was a life of contradictions. On one hand, there were opportunities, a world of privilege, doors that opened effortlessly. On the other, there was a shadow so long, so heavy, that finding his own identity seemed impossible. In interviews from 2016, Nick openly discussed the toll of living in such a shadow. "Fame," he said, "sort of informs who you are, shaping expectations and perceptions in ways that were often suffocating." In an attempt to define himself, he admitted to adopting a rebellious, angry, and at times destructive persona, one fueled by drugs, defiance, and a longing to carve out a space that was uniquely his. It's a narrative familiar in many celebrity families, the pressure to honor a legacy colliding with the urgent desire to escape it. Yet even as Nick struggled with identity and recognition, his parents carried enormous guilt. Rob and Michelle, deeply loving and committed, tried in every way possible to guide him, to support him, and to help him find purpose. In 2015, they collaborated with Nick on the film Being Charlie, a project designed not just as a creative endeavor, but as a lifeline, a way to connect, to build confidence, and to show him a path forward. The hope was tangible, the intention pure, but sometimes even the best-laid plans can falter when the storms inside a person are already raging. What makes this tragedy even more haunting is the complexity of the relationships involved. Here we have a father who built a legendary career, a mother who devoted herself to family and philanthropy, a son who oscillated between love and resentment, and a daughter caught in the impossible position of discovering the unthinkable. The contradictions are painful, a family that symbolizes success and laughter in the public eye, yet privately fractured in ways that ultimately led to devastation. The contrast between what the world saw and what was happening behind closed doors is staggering. And then there's Mel Brooks' warning, echoing through the narrative like a ghost. Imagine being told that someone you trust, someone with a lifetime of experience, sees danger on a path you're walking. It ends in tears, or worse. Those words are chilling enough to replay in your mind. How often do we get the chance to heed such warnings in our lives? And what happens when they are ignored, misunderstood, or dismissed? In this case, the warning was personal, intimate, and prophetic. But warnings only matter if someone listens. And in the end, listening wasn't enough to prevent tragedy. This story is about more than just fame or fortune. It is about the human condition, the fragile intersection of love, expectation, identity, and failure. It forces us to confront uncomfortable questions. Can love alone prevent destruction? Can legacy become a burden so heavy it crushes the very people meant to carry it? And perhaps most importantly, how do family secrets, unresolved conflicts, and unspoken resentments escalate into acts that no one could have imagined? From the moment news broke, the world reacted with disbelief. Social media exploded, speculation ran rampant, and friends and colleagues tried to process a reality that seemed like a script too dark to be true. Yet the tragedy also highlighted patterns we often overlook in celebrity families, patterns of pressure, expectation, rebellion, and the consequences of unresolved emotional tension. Here was a son who had spent years wrestling with his place in a world defined by others' accomplishments, and in the end, that struggle manifested in a way no one could ignore. And yet, even with all the public scrutiny, the story is still unfolding. Investigators are working, details are emerging, and questions remain about the forces that led to this night of horror. There is a painful truth lurking beneath the headlines. Fame does not inoculate a family from tragedy. Money cannot shield against emotional fracture. Legacy does not guarantee understanding or acceptance. And warnings, no matter how sincere or dire, can be tragically unheeded. So, as we begin to unravel the story of Mel Brooks' warning, Rob and Michelle Reiner's lives, and the storm that led to their deaths, one question remains at the forefront. Could anyone have stopped it? Could intervention, understanding, or even empathy have prevented the worst? Or were the pieces already in motion, destined to collide no matter how much love or warning existed? The answers are buried within layers of family history, personal struggle, and societal pressures. They are hidden in the choices made over decades, in the unspoken resentments, in the identity crises, and in the ambitions that sometimes become dangerous when left unchecked. And as we dig deeper into this story, we will encounter contradictions that defy easy explanation, emotional beats that will make your heart ache, and revelations that will challenge everything you thought you knew about fame, family, and tragedy. The warning came in a moment that, at the time, seemed like any other casual conversation between old friends. Rob Reiner and Mel Brooks had known each other for decades, two titans of American comedy whose work had shaped generations. They shared laughs, triumphs, and the occasional misstep. But one day, somewhere in the private quiet of a home, or perhaps backstage after an event, Mel leaned in, and what he said would haunt Rob for the rest of his life. "You're walking a path I wouldn't wish on anyone. It ends in tears, or worse." Think about that for a second. What does it mean to hear such words from someone whose entire existence is built on timing, observation, and understanding human nature? It isn't casual advice. It isn't a quip tossed in jest. It is a dire prediction, a prophecy of disaster veiled as concern. And yet, Rob, like most of us, likely thought he understood the world better than anyone else could explain it to him. How often do we dismiss warnings, even when they come wrapped in urgency and experience? To understand why Mel would say such a thing, we have to go back, not just years, but decades, into the Reiner family dynamics. Rob and Michelle were the epitome of public success. Rob, the son of legendary comedian Carl Reiner, had carved out his own path as a filmmaker, actor, and writer. Michelle, strong, intelligent, and compassionate, had built her life around family and philanthropy. Their home in Brentwood was luxurious, a symbol of achievement and the American dream. But as with any family, appearances only told part of the story. Nick Reiner, their son, had always lived in the shadow of that legacy. From a young age, he experienced both the privileges and the pressures that come with being the child of two iconic figures. Publicly, he had access to the world, the films, the fame, the industry connections. Privately, however, he wrestled with expectations that could crush anyone. He wanted recognition, validation, and a sense of self in a world that seemed to predefine him as someone else. The son of Rob Reiner, the grandson of Carl Reiner. Mel Brooks, who had seen the rise and fall of many careers, the weight of family expectation, and the dangers of unaddressed resentment, noticed the signs early. Perhaps he saw the subtle anger, the flashes of entitlement, the way Nick's struggles were ignored or underestimated by those who loved him most. And in that moment with Rob, he delivered the warning. A warning not just about decisions, but about the dangerous trajectory of a person who feels trapped by fame, legacy, and unmet expectations. But warnings, no matter how sincere, only matter if they are taken seriously. Rob and Michelle, devoted and loving, had spent years trying to guide their son. They tried mentorship, collaboration, and even creative projects like being Charlie to channel his energy, creativity, and personal struggles into something constructive. Yet, as anyone who has faced family turmoil knows, guidance and warnings can only go so far. When someone is caught between anger, entitlement, and identity crises, even the most heartfelt counsel may not reach them. The irony of the situation is cruel. Mel Brooks, a man whose career thrived on humor, timing, and human insight, recognized a path leading to heartbreak before anyone else did. He saw a family dynamic spiraling toward disaster, a trajectory defined by unmet needs, resentment, and miscommunication. And yet, the very warning that could have been a lifeline was destined, tragically, to go largely unheeded. Let's pause for a moment and consider. How many times have we ignored warnings in our own lives? How many times have we been told, by someone wiser, someone who understands the stakes better than we do, that we're heading down a dangerous path, and yet we proceed anyway? This is a story about fame, yes, but it is also a story about human nature, about pride, about the blind spots we all carry. And for the Reiners, those blind spots proved fatal. The warning also highlights an uncomfortable truth about family dynamics in households burdened by legacy. Parents can love endlessly, can provide opportunities, can try to shield their children from harm, but they cannot always prevent a child from making choices that lead to disaster. Rob and Michelle's lives were full of effort, full of care, and full of hope for Nick's future. But Mel's words hinted at a reality that even their devotion could not alter. There are forces within a person, psychological pressures, and unresolved tensions that even love cannot always counteract. And the more we examine Nick's history, the clearer the warning becomes. His identity struggles were well documented. From his adolescence into adulthood, he wrestled with the suffocating weight of expectation, the invisible burden of living up to a legendary family name. Interviews from 2016 reveal a young man aware of the shadow that loomed over him and desperate to define himself apart from it. He sought rebellion, anger, and risky behavior as a means of establishing an identity that the public had not preordained for him. Yet, in those same moments, he remained trapped by the very family he resented, caught between the desire for independence and the pull of legacy. Family sources describe him as entitled, a man who expected the world to grant him privileges and recognition without the requisite effort. He wanted success, admiration, and love, but was unwilling or unable to invest in the work and emotional labor required to earn them. This expectation, when left unchecked, became a tinderbox. Add to it the frustration of feeling misunderstood by a family who loved him, yet could not fully resolve the struggles that haunted him, and you see the conditions for tragedy beginning to take shape. Mel Brooks' warning, then, was not a casual observation. It was the recognition of a perfect storm. Entitlement, resentment, identity crisis, and pressure from a legacy that weighed more heavily on Nick than anyone could have anticipated. And yet, warnings are only part of the story. The real tragedy lies in what happens when they are ignored, when guidance is dismissed, and when circumstances align in ways that even love cannot rectify. Consider, too, the weight of public perception. The Reiners lived lives under scrutiny, their achievements celebrated, their mistakes magnified. For Nick, growing up in such an environment meant that every misstep was amplified, every failure more visible. The constant comparison to his father and grandfather likely compounded feelings of inadequacy, driving him toward the rebellion and risky behavior that he hoped would define him. But rebellion without direction, anger without intervention, can be devastating and sometimes deadly. Even the attempts to intervene, to guide, and to provide structure could not entirely counteract the forces at play. Rob and Michelle's efforts with Being Charlie are emblematic of this struggle. They tried to channel Nick's creativity and personal struggles into a constructive outlet, to help him find purpose, to help him establish an identity that was separate from the towering legacy surrounding him. But those efforts, while noble and loving, were not enough to prevent the trajectory Mel had warned about. And so the question lingers, haunting in its inevitability. If Mel Brooks saw it coming, why couldn't anyone prevent it? The answer lies in the complexity of human behavior, in the interplay between love and autonomy, expectation and resentment. Warnings, no matter how prescient, cannot override the decisions of a person determined to follow their own path. Even if that path leads to tragedy, it is this intersection of foresight and inevitability, of warning and consequence, that sets the stage for the story we are about to unfold. This is a story of love and failure, of legacy and rebellion, of a family whose brilliance and devotion were unable to prevent the worst imaginable outcome. And as we move deeper into the Reiner family's story, into the days, weeks, and decades leading up to that fateful night, the shadow cast by Mel's warning looms larger with each revelation. A Hollywood dream. Their Brentwood estate, a sprawling $13.5 million mansion nestled in one of Los Angeles's most exclusive neighborhoods, gleamed under the California sun, a testament to decades of success, talent, and careful curation. Gardens were immaculate, interiors tastefully decorated, and every corner reflected both comfort and prestige. To a passerby, or even a casual fan, the Reiners epitomized perfection, fame, fortune, family, and fulfillment. But the reality beneath the glossy surface was far more complex. The pressures of Hollywood fame were only one part of the picture. Rob Reiner, 78, son of Carl Reiner, had inherited a legacy so large it cast shadows across every family member's life. He was a filmmaker whose work defined generations, an actor whose performances were admired, a public figure whose name carried weight in every corner of the entertainment world. Michelle, 70, balanced her public life with the private labor of maintaining family stability, offering love, guidance, and support to children and grandchildren alike. Yet despite all appearances, perfection is rarely what it seems. Every home has cracks, every family has tensions, and the Reiners were no exception. Publicly, they were the embodiment of success, but behind closed doors, the challenges of maintaining harmony, managing expectations, and addressing individual struggles created a tension few could understand. Their marriage, while enduring, was a partnership tested not only by fame but by the intricate dynamics of family, legacy, and personal identity. Rob and Michelle's love story was built on shared ambition, mutual respect, and a commitment to family. They navigated Hollywood's highs and lows together, supporting each other through career shifts, public scrutiny, and the relentless pressures of their industry. Michelle, often described by friends as the stabilizing force in Rob's life, took on responsibilities that extended beyond typical parenting. She mediated disputes, offered counsel, and provided a sense of normalcy in a world often defined by chaos and performance. But normalcy is relative, and in the Reiner household, the pressures on their son, Nick, created a strain that even the strongest foundations could not entirely absorb. Nick, 32, lived in the guest house on the Brentwood property, a physical distance that belied the emotional proximity of a family constantly negotiating love, resentment, and expectation. From a young age, Nick's personality clashed with the family's public image of achievement and balance. His rebellion, often misunderstood by friends and observers, was a coping mechanism in a home where the weight of legacy and fame could feel overwhelming. Reports described Nick as entitled, someone who expected the world to bend toward him without regard for effort or consequence. His parents, despite their devotion, struggled to channel this entitlement into constructive paths. The family's attempts to guide him through projects like Being Charlie were earnest efforts to bridge gaps, provide purpose, and offer validation. Yet these interventions, though meaningful, could not fully counteract the internal pressures and identity crises Nick faced. Consider the duality of the Reiners' existence. On one side, a home filled with opportunity, love, and prestige. On the other, an emotional landscape marked by tension, miscommunication, and unspoken grievances. The contrast is stark, and it underscores a truth often ignored in narratives about fame. External success does not equate to internal peace. The Reiners' lives were emblematic of this tension, illustrating how a family can appear flawless while privately grappling with forces capable of fracturing even the closest bonds. Even the attempts to intervene, to guide, and to provide structure could not entirely counteract the forces at play. Rob and Michelle's efforts with Being Charlie are emblematic of this struggle. They tried to channel Nick's creativity and personal struggles into a constructive outlet, to help him find purpose, to help him establish an identity that was separate from the towering legacy surrounding him. But those efforts, while noble and loving, were not enough to prevent the trajectory Mel had warned about. And so the question lingers, haunting in its inevitability. If Mel Brooks saw it coming, why couldn't anyone prevent it? The answer lies in the complexity of human behavior, in the interplay between love and autonomy, expectation and resentment. Warnings, no matter how prescient, cannot override the decisions of a person determined to follow their own path. Even if that path leads to tragedy, it is this intersection of foresight and inevitability, of warning and consequence, that sets the stage for the story we are about to unfold. This is a story of love and failure, of legacy and rebellion, of a family whose brilliance and devotion were unable to prevent the worst imaginable outcome. And as we move deeper into the Reiner family's story, into the days, weeks, and decades leading up to that fateful night, the shadow cast by Mel's warning looms larger with each revelation. A Hollywood dream. Their Brentwood estate, a sprawling $13.5 million mansion nestled in one of Los Angeles' most exclusive neighborhoods, gleamed under the California sun, a testament to decades of success, talent, and careful curation. Gardens were immaculate, interiors tastefully decorated, and every corner reflected both comfort and prestige. To a passerby, or even a casual fan, the Reiners epitomized perfection, fame, fortune, family, and fulfillment. But the reality beneath the glossy surface was far more complex. The pressures of Hollywood fame were only one part of the picture. Rob Reiner, 78, son of Carl Reiner, had inherited a legacy so large it cast shadows across every family member's life. He was a filmmaker whose work defined generations, an actor whose performances were admired, a public figure whose name carried weight in every corner of the entertainment world. Michelle, 70, balanced her public life with the private labor of maintaining family stability, offering love, guidance, and support to children and grandchildren alike. Yet despite all appearances, perfection is rarely what it seems. Every home has cracks, every family has tensions, and the Reiners were no exception. Publicly, they were the embodiment of success, but behind closed doors, the challenges of maintaining harmony, managing expectations, and addressing individual struggles created a tension few could understand. Their marriage, while enduring, was a partnership tested not only by fame but by the intricate dynamics of family, legacy, and personal identity. Rob and Michelle's love story was built on shared ambition, mutual respect, and a commitment to family. They navigated Hollywood's highs and lows together, supporting each other through career shifts, public scrutiny, and the relentless pressures of their industry. Michelle, often described by friends as the stabilizing force in Rob's life, took on responsibilities that extended beyond typical parenting. She mediated disputes, offered counsel, and provided a sense of normalcy in a world often defined by chaos and performance. But normalcy is relative, and in the Reiner household, the pressures on their son, Nick, created a strain that even the strongest foundations could not entirely absorb. Nick, 32, lived in the guest house on the Brentwood property, a physical distance that belied the emotional proximity of a family constantly negotiating love, resentment, and expectation. From a young age, Nick's personality clashed with the family's public image of achievement and balance. His rebellion, often misunderstood by friends and observers, was a coping mechanism in a home where the weight of legacy and fame could feel overwhelming. Reports described Nick as entitled, someone who expected the world to bend toward him without regard for effort or consequence. His parents, despite their devotion, struggled to channel this entitlement into constructive paths. The family's attempts to guide him through projects like Being Charlie were earnest efforts to bridge gaps, provide purpose, and offer validation. Yet these interventions, though meaningful, could not fully counteract the internal pressures and identity crises Nick faced. Consider the duality of the Reiners' existence. On one side, a home filled with opportunity, love, and prestige. On the other, an emotional landscape marked by tension, miscommunication, and unspoken grievances. The contrast is stark, and it underscores a truth often ignored in narratives about fame. External success does not equate to internal peace. The Reiners' lives were emblematic of this tension, illustrating how a family can appear flawless while privately grappling with forces capable of fracturing even the closest bonds. Friends and acquaintances describe Rob and Michelle as deeply loving and patient, yet aware of the challenges posed by their son's struggles. They recognized the stakes, understood the potential for conflict, and yet remained committed to providing guidance and support. The tragic irony is that even with foresight, even with the capacity to intervene, some outcomes are difficult, if not impossible, to prevent. And then there is the public perception versus private reality. Hollywood, like many social environments, thrives on appearances. Fans, media, and colleagues often see only the curated image. Awards, premieres, interviews, and photos of a smiling family. But in the Reiner home, reality was more nuanced. The pressures of legacy, the strain of identity struggles, and the complex dynamics between parents and children created a subtle but persistent tension, one that would ultimately reach a catastrophic breaking point. The tragic events of that fateful Sunday shattered not just the Reiners' home, but the very notion of perfection we associate with families like theirs. Rob and Michelle, whose lives had been celebrated for decades, became victims of a family dynamic that no amount of fame or love could fully mitigate. Their deaths highlight a harsh reality. Sometimes, the most seemingly secure and enviable lives conceal vulnerabilities so deep that no warning, no matter how prescient, can prevent disaster. And yet, even in this darkness, it is impossible to overlook the extraordinary lives they led. Rob Reiner's contributions to film, television, and culture are immeasurable. Michelle's devotion to family and community left an indelible mark on those around her. Together, they exemplified resilience, love, and the pursuit of meaningful work. But as often happens in families, the very strengths that sustain a household can also mask underlying fractures. Love can coexist with dysfunction, devotion with misunderstanding, and stability with unseen tension. Perhaps this is why Mel Brooks' warning resonated so deeply. He saw the subtle forces at play, the potential for escalation that others might have overlooked. He understood the stakes, recognized the patterns, and tried to intervene in the only way he could, by issuing a clear, stark warning to Rob. And while Rob and Michelle's devotion to family was unmatched, it was insufficient against the psychological and emotional currents that had been building for decades within their son. We often assume that families with resources, intelligence, and access are immune to tragedy. The Reiner story dismantles that assumption entirely. It reveals a truth that is both universal and terrifying. Tragedy does not discriminate, and familial love, while powerful, has limits when confronted by unresolved anger, entitlement, and identity crises. And so, as we reflect on the apparent perfection of the Reiner's life, we must also confront the hidden forces that shaped it. A home of luxury and laughter, of talent and devotion, was also a crucible of expectations, pressures, and emotional tension. The stage was set for a collision that no one could have predicted in full, yet in retrospect, the warning signs were everywhere. If only anyone had known how to interpret them. Sunday morning began like any other in Brentwood. The sun rose over the manicured lawns of the Reiner estate, casting long shadows across perfectly trimmed hedges and immaculately maintained gardens. Birds chirped in the soft California light, and the distant hum of traffic blended with the occasional rustle of leaves. To the casual observer, it was a day like any other, a day of coffee, routines, and quiet domesticity. But beneath that veneer of normalcy, a storm was about to shatter everything. Inside the mansion, Rob and Michelle Reiner had spent the early hours as they often did. Rob perhaps reviewing scripts or emails, Michelle tending to household matters, both engaged in the rhythms of life that had carried them through decades of fame, family, and success. Meanwhile, Nick, 32, lived in the guest house, a physical separation from the main house that belied the emotional proximity and tension that had been simmering for years. The stage was set for a tragedy that no one could have fully anticipated, yet which, in retrospect, seems almost inevitable. The discovery of Rob and Michelle's bodies by their daughter, Romy, 27, would later be described as horrifying, surreal, and utterly devastating. Romy had walked into a scene that defied comprehension, a scene that would haunt her for the rest of her life. Police reports indicate that she immediately pointed to a dangerous family member, suggesting that the suspect was someone close, someone whose presence in their lives had long been marked by tension and volatility. The shock of realizing that the threat came from within the family added a layer of psychological trauma to an already unimaginable situation. What makes this day so significant is the way it exposed the fragility of even the most carefully constructed lives. The Reiners had spent decades building not just careers, but a family reputation rooted in love, creativity, and achievement. Yet all it took was a single day for that carefully maintained facade to crumble. It's a stark reminder that tragedy is often not a sudden rupture, but the culmination of years of tension, unaddressed struggles, and subtle warning signs that went unheeded. In the hours following the discovery, law enforcement scrambled to piece together what had happened. Neighbors reported hearing nothing unusual. The quiet suburban street seemed unchanged, untouched by the horror that had occurred within the estate. But inside, the Reiner home had become a crime scene, a place where joy and legacy collided with violence and despair. The psychological shock to the family was compounded by public scrutiny. Social media erupted almost immediately, with speculation, condolences, and horror spreading across platforms. The world, previously captivated by the Reiners' work and accomplishments, now grappled with a narrative of betrayal, tragedy, and unfathomable loss. The initial focus of investigators quickly turned to Nick. While initial reports were cautious, citing him as a potential suspect, the fact that he lived on the property, had a history of emotional volatility, and had long-standing tensions with his parents placed him squarely in the investigative spotlight. The juxtaposition is almost cinematic. A son whose life had been shaped by legacy, expectation, and internal struggle now standing accused of the ultimate act of betrayal. To understand the depth of this moment, it's important to explore Nick's history. His struggles with identity, resentment toward his father's prolific career, and perceived limitations imposed by the Reiner legacy were well documented. Friends, family sources, and interviews paint a picture of a young man caught between entitlement and frustration, ambition and failure, love and rage. He had long sought to define himself outside the shadow of his family, yet the very fame he resisted had been the framework of his existence. That conflict, left unresolved, became increasingly toxic over time. Even before the tragedy, there were warning signs, subtle, often dismissed, but deeply concerning. Nick's rebellious behavior, anger outbursts, and struggles with addiction were all part of a pattern that friends and family observed but struggled to address. Rob and Michelle had done everything they could to support him, from creative collaboration to emotional guidance. The 2015 film Being Charlie was one such effort, designed to give Nick a sense of purpose and identity in a world dominated by the shadow of his father and grandfather. Yet, even these efforts, though noble, could not fully mitigate the deep-seated resentment and identity crisis that had been building for decades. As investigators pieced together the events of that morning, the horror of the scene became clear. The violence was intimate, personal, and devastating. It was a crime not of opportunity, but of intent, suggesting that the perpetrator knew the victims well and acted in a moment of extreme emotional intensity. For Romy, the discovery of her parents' bodies was traumatic in ways that words can barely capture. Not only was she forced to confront the immediate horror, but she also had to process the fact that a family member, a brother she knew, loved, and trusted, was implicated in the deaths of her parents. Public reaction, too, was a mixture of disbelief, grief, and morbid curiosity. Social media threads exploded with speculation about motive, family dynamics, and the pressures that may have led to the tragedy. News outlets scrambled to provide context, digging into Nick's history, the family's public appearances, and the Reiner legacy. Yet, even with this intense scrutiny, the human story at the center, the emotional complexity, the psychological undercurrents, the intimate family struggles, remained largely obscured, hidden beneath layers of speculation and headlines. One of the most chilling aspects of that day is how quickly the narrative shifted from public curiosity to profound personal reflection. Friends and colleagues of the Reiners, people who had known them for decades, began to revisit moments that, at the time, seemed trivial or benign. Small conflicts, comments, or behaviors took on new significance in light of the tragedy. Suddenly, the subtle signs that might have predicted or prevented the disaster were seen in stark relief. Hindsight, as always, offered clarity that no one could have had in the moment. And yet, despite all the chaos, the warning from Mel Brooks echoes louder than ever. You're walking a path I wouldn't wish on anyone. It ends in tears, or worse. That path, observed years before by someone intimately familiar with human behavior and familial pressures, culminated in an event that shocked the world. The tragedy was both sudden and long anticipated, a painful reminder that some forces, once set in motion, are nearly impossible to halt. The day the world changed for the Reiner family serves as a case study in the collision of legacy, identity, and unresolved emotional tension. It shows how the pressures of fame, when coupled with personal struggles and family dynamics, can lead to outcomes that are as tragic as they are inevitable. It is a story that forces us to reconsider assumptions about wealth, privilege, and happiness, demonstrating that no amount of external success can insulate a family from the consequences of internal discord. As we look closer at the events that led up to that day, the patterns of conflict, resentment, and struggle become increasingly clear. Nick's sense of entitlement, his perception of the family legacy as a burden, and the ongoing identity crisis that defined his adulthood all played critical roles in shaping the circumstances of that tragic Sunday. Every moment, every choice, and every unresolved conflict contributed to a perfect storm, one that no amount of love, guidance, or warning could fully prevent. And yet, the story is far from over. While the events of that morning marked a catastrophic turning point, they are only part of a larger narrative that spans decades, revealing the complex interplay of family loyalty, expectation, rebellion, and tragedy. The Reiner story is not just about a single day. It is about the years of struggle, the warnings ignored, and the invisible fractures that can exist even in the most celebrated families. The immediate question that gripped everyone following the discovery of Rob and Michelle Reiner's bodies was as stark as it was unthinkable. Who could commit such an act? In most tragic crimes, the world looks for strangers, for the classic unknown intruder, the random violence that makes people question safety and security. But in this case, the answer was far more disturbing, far closer to home than anyone could have imagined. From the first moments of the investigation, attention turned to the one person who had both proximity and opportunity. Nick Reiner, the 32-year-old son who lived in the guest house on the property. A man whose entire life had been entwined with the Reiner legacy, whose identity had been forged in the shadow of his father and grandfather, was suddenly the focus of suspicion. For a moment, it seemed surreal. How could a son, a brother, a member of a celebrated and loving family, become the central figure in such a horrifying act? To understand the gravity of this question, it is necessary to look at Nick's upbringing, his personality, and the forces that shaped his emotional and psychological landscape. Growing up in the Reiner household meant constant exposure to brilliance, achievement, and expectation. Rob Reiner's career had already established a high bar, and the legacy of Carl Reiner loomed even larger. For any child, especially one as sensitive and ambitious as Nick, this environment could inspire greatness, or provoke resentment, identity struggles, and a desperate desire to break free. Friends and family sources describe Nick as intelligent and creative, but also deeply troubled. Early signs of rebellion and frustration were often brushed off as typical adolescent behavior or the consequences of living in the shadow of famous relatives. But over time, these behaviors escalated, forming patterns of entitlement, frustration, and a need for recognition that frequently clashed with the family's expectations and values. He wanted the love, acceptance, and social status his parents had cultivated. But he expected it on his terms, without the work or sacrifice that defined their lives. These dynamics are critical because they offer context to the unimaginable question: how does a family member, a son, reach a point where violence becomes conceivable? The answer is not simple, nor is it singular. It is a confluence of unmet emotional needs, unresolved resentment, identity crises, and perhaps a sense of inevitability that the world is unfair. Nick's history reveals layers of frustration. A sense of invisibility, a longing for independence, and a simmering resentment toward a family legacy he felt trapped by. Even as these forces played out privately, the Reiners remained devoted and hopeful. They sought to guide Nick, to provide support, and to help him carve a path that could satisfy both his personal ambitions and his family's expectations. The 2015 film Being Charlie was a notable effort in this direction, a collaborative project meant to give Nick a sense of purpose, to channel his talents, and to offer an outlet for his struggles. But these efforts, while heartfelt, could not fully reconcile the internal tension that had been building for decades. The warning from Mel Brooks, delivered privately to Rob, had foreshadowed exactly this kind of escalation, but even insight from someone as perceptive as Mel could not stop the forces within Nick from reaching a breaking point. On that fateful Sunday, the culmination of these pressures and unresolved conflicts became tragically clear. Nick's proximity to the main house, his familiarity with the family's routines, and the emotional volatility he carried all positioned him as the primary suspect. Yet, understanding the motive is far more complicated than simple anger or rebellion. It involves unpacking a lifetime of expectation, frustration, and identity struggle, a mix of psychological, social, and emotional elements that created a perfect storm for tragedy. Reports later indicated that Nick felt intense pressure from the family legacy and struggled with his own sense of self. He reportedly resented his father's prolific career, feeling both overshadowed and burdened by the achievements of Rob and Carl Reiner. At the same time, he had ambitions and desires that seemed incompatible with the structure and expectations of the family. This internal conflict, left unresolved over decades, created a tinderbox of emotional intensity. What makes this situation even more tragic is the human element. Rob and Michelle were parents deeply committed to their son. Their love was not conditional. Their efforts to guide, support, and understand him were persistent and genuine. Yet love alone cannot always counteract the forces of resentment, identity struggle, and emotional instability. Even the most devoted guidance cannot always redirect a person who feels trapped, invisible, or fundamentally misunderstood. The question, who could do this, ultimately forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about family, legacy, and human psychology. It is easy to cast blame, to point to a single act or moment. But in reality, such tragedies are the result of cumulative forces, years of emotional tension, patterns of entitlement and frustration, and a complex interplay between individual personality and family dynamics. Nick Reiner's alleged actions are horrifying, yes. But they are also the visible endpoint of struggles that had been simmering long before that Sunday. And yet, there are still nuances to consider. While Nick is the focal point of suspicion, the story cannot be reduced to a single individual. It is a story about how families operate under the weight of fame and expectation, how unresolved conflicts and unaddressed emotional needs can escalate, and how even the most loving and vigilant parents can be powerless against the internal forces shaping a child's decisions. The horror of that day is amplified by the realization that it didn't occur in isolation. It was the culmination of a lifetime of dynamics, pressures, and missed signals. In the aftermath, the world struggled to reconcile the image of the Reiners as a loving, accomplished, and admired family with the reality of the tragedy. Media coverage focused on the shock, the details of the crime scene, and the arrest. Social media erupted with speculation, debate, and moral judgment. But beneath the headlines lies the human story. The pain, the disappointment, the identity struggles, and the sense of inevitability that can sometimes accompany prolonged tension and unmet needs. Friends who knew Nick described him as a man wrestling with invisible demons, someone whose behavior had long suggested volatility, but whose potential for violence was unimaginable to those closest to him. The contrast between who he was publicly, an intelligent, creative individual with opportunities, and the actions he allegedly took that day creates a profound sense of cognitive dissonance. How could someone so closely tied to love, guidance, and family support become the instrument of such devastation? This chapter in the Reiner tragedy highlights a painful and essential truth. Family bonds, no matter how strong, are not always enough to prevent disaster. Legacy, fame, and love can coexist with resentment, entitlement, and identity struggle. The closer the relationship, the more profound the betrayal feels. And when tragedy strikes from within, the psychological impact is magnified exponentially, leaving those left behind to navigate grief, shock, and incomprehension. Even as law enforcement continues its investigation, questions remain. Was there a specific trigger that day? Could intervention have prevented the escalation? Were there signs so subtle that only hindsight reveals them? Each of these questions underscores the complexity of family dynamics and the fragility of human relationships, particularly when compounded by fame, expectation, and unresolved emotional conflict. And yet, even in this darkness, one fact remains clear. The person who could do this was not a stranger. It was someone intimately known, someone shaped by the love, guidance, and limitations of the family itself. The tragedy forces us to confront an uncomfortable reality. That sometimes the most dangerous forces come not from outside, but from within. Growing up as the son of Rob Reiner and the grandson of Carl Reiner is not just an upbringing. It is a life lived in the glare of inevitability. From the earliest moments, Nick Reiner's world was defined by legacy, expectation, and the constant comparison to figures whose names were etched into the cultural consciousness. Imagine being a child in a home where the walls are not just decorated with family photos, but with history, awards, accolades, scripts, and memories of achievements so monumental they overshadow the ordinary moments of daily life. This was Nick's reality. To understand the weight of living in such a shadow, consider the contrast between potential and autonomy. Every opportunity that Nick had, from access to Hollywood insiders to collaborative projects with his father, was simultaneously a gift and a burden. On one hand, these resources could have been tools to build a life defined by his own choices. On the other hand, they were constant reminders that every success he achieved would inevitably be measured against the towering achievements of Rob and Carl Reiner. The pressure to distinguish oneself, to claim a unique identity, is immense under any circumstances. In Nick's case, it became a crucible of expectation, resentment, and self-doubt. Interviews and public statements from Nick provide insight into his struggle. In 2016, he admitted that growing up in the shadow of such iconic figures left him feeling invisible in ways that are difficult for most people to imagine. Fame, he said, sort of informs who you are, shaping not only how others perceive you, but how you perceive yourself. For Nick, this translated into a desperate need to create an identity that was entirely separate from the one the world had already imposed. The rebellion, the anger, and the experimentation with drugs were not just acts of defiance. They were attempts at self-definition in a world that seemed unwilling to see him as anything other than the sum of his family's legacy. Yet rebellion comes with consequences. As Nick's struggle for identity intensified, so too did tension within the family. Rob and Michelle, devoted and patient, tried to provide guidance, support, and outlets for creative expression. Projects like Being Charlie were designed not only to engage Nick creatively, but to offer a sense of accomplishment and purpose. They hoped that collaboration could provide the validation he sought while helping him navigate the complexities of fame and expectation. However, these interventions, though well-intentioned, could not fully address the deeper emotional currents that had been building over decades. Friends and acquaintances described Nick as intelligent, sensitive, and charismatic, yet also volatile and unpredictable. His personality reflected a complex interplay between entitlement and insecurity, ambition and frustration. He wanted success and recognition, but often on terms that conflicted with the family's values and expectations. He wanted the privileges of fame without the effort, the admiration without the work. This imbalance created a tension that escalated over time, shaping both his relationships with his parents and his own internal narrative about self-worth and belonging. The shadow of fame can be cruel. It magnifies flaws, highlights failures, and perpetually measures the next generation against the benchmarks set by the previous one. For Nick, every achievement, every attempt at self-expression was inevitably filtered through the lens of legacy. Even successes that might have been celebrated by an ordinary family were weighed against the monumental accomplishments of his father and grandfather. It is a pressure that can distort perception, breed resentment, and drive behaviors that might otherwise seem inexplicable. Family sources emphasize that Nick's struggles were not merely a matter of privilege or rebellion. They were symptomatic of deeper emotional and psychological challenges. He wrestled with identity, self-worth, and the feeling of being trapped in roles defined by others. His parents, aware of these challenges, carried immense guilt over their inability to fully alleviate his struggles. They tried interventions, creative projects, and emotional support, yet the internal conflicts persisted, deepening over time and creating an environment ripe for tension and eventual tragedy. Consider also the social aspect of fame. Nick's exposure to the Hollywood world, with its emphasis on image, perception, and status, compounded his internal struggle. He witnessed firsthand the rewards and admiration that fame could bring, yet he felt increasingly disconnected from the foundation that had earned those accolades. This dissonance between desire and attainment, expectation and reality, intensified his sense of isolation and frustration. The very world that offered him opportunities also highlighted the limitations of his own autonomy and agency. And yet, amidst these struggles, there were glimpses of promise and potential. Nick possessed creativity, intelligence, and charisma, qualities that, if nurtured under different circumstances, might have led to fulfillment and achievement. But the tension between inherited legacy and personal ambition, between parental guidance and the desire for independence, created a volatile mix. It is the story of a life defined by contrasts, opportunity and pressure, love and resentment, visibility and invisibility. This duality, of being both privileged and trapped, celebrated yet overshadowed, shaped not only Nick's identity, but the dynamics of the Reiner family as a whole. The interactions between father and son, mother and son, reflected a constant negotiation between affection, expectation, and the struggle for autonomy. Rob and Michelle's efforts to balance guidance with freedom were commendable, yet they could not eliminate the emotional fractures that had formed over years of unresolved tension. And then there is the public perception versus private reality. To the outside world, the Reiners were a family of accomplishment, stability, and charm. But private accounts reveal a more complicated story, one of repeated frustrations, unmet needs, and an ever-present tension between love and resentment. Nick's struggle to define himself outside the family legacy, coupled with the family's struggle to support him, set the stage for escalating conflict, emotional volatility, and ultimately, tragedy. As we reflect on this life in the shadow of fame, it becomes clear that tragedy was not a sudden eruption. It was the accumulation of years of tension, expectation, and internal struggle. Every effort by Rob and Michelle, every attempt at guidance or collaboration, was a step toward resolution. But the deeper forces at play, the unresolved resentments and identity crises, persisted. The warning from Mel Brooks, delivered privately to Rob, loomed larger in retrospect. A prescient acknowledgement of a path fraught with danger, a path that Nick seemed destined to walk. This chapter in Nick Reiner's life highlights the profound psychological pressures faced by children of famous parents. It underscores the complexity of identity formation in a world where family legacy looms large, where love and expectation collide, and where the search for autonomy can manifest in both creativity and destructive behavior. It also forces us to consider a chilling reality. Even the most devoted parents, even the most thoughtful interventions, cannot always redirect the course of a life shaped by unresolved emotional conflict. And as the narrative of the Reiner family tragedy unfolds, one question becomes increasingly unavoidable. How did these forces culminate in the unthinkable? How did a lifetime of shadow, resentment, and identity struggle lead to violence within a family whose love was otherwise unwavering? One of the most striking elements in understanding the tragedy of the Reiner family is the notion of entitlement, how it developed, how it shaped behavior, and how it contributed to a catastrophic outcome. Nick Reiner's life offers a textbook example of how privilege, when combined with expectation and a lack of accountability, can create emotional volatility capable of devastating consequences. To many, the concept of entitlement is abstract, a philosophical critique of a social condition. But in Nick's case, it was tangible, lived, and ultimately destructive. From childhood, Nick had access to opportunities that few could ever imagine. The Reiner family legacy, bolstered by decades of success in Hollywood, meant access to industry connections, creative mentorship, and financial security. But entitlement is rarely about mere access. It is about perception, expectation, and the emotional lens through which one interprets their environment. Nick reportedly expected not only opportunities but the admiration, recognition, and social acceptance that came naturally to his parents and grandfather, without necessarily investing the corresponding effort. Friends and family describe him as someone who wanted the life that didn't exist. In other words, Nick craved the privileges and visibility of a Reiner, but without the responsibilities, work ethic, or personal accountability required to sustain that level of success. It's a subtle but profound distinction. Entitlement is not merely desire. It is the expectation that the world owes you a certain status, a certain outcome, regardless of effort. And when that expectation is unmet, frustration, resentment, and anger can fester. The intersection of entitlement and expectation is where much of the tragedy originates. Nick's upbringing was both nurturing and high pressure. His parents loved him deeply, but love alone does not equal unconditional success or fulfillment. Rob and Michelle attempted to guide him, to provide both freedom and structure, to channel his creativity through projects like Being Charlie. Yet even these interventions, designed with care and intention, could not fully satisfy the complex psychological needs shaped by years of legacy pressure and identity struggle. This struggle was compounded by the social environment surrounding Nick. Growing up in Hollywood, the stakes are magnified by visibility. Every misstep is observed, every success measured against a broader standard of fame. Nick's desire to carve his own path clashed with these social realities. He wanted autonomy, recognition, and independence, yet his environment constantly reminded him of the family's shadow. The tension between expectation and reality created a volatile psychological landscape, where entitlement and frustration could combine with catastrophic consequences. Family sources suggest that Nick's entitlement manifested in both small and large ways. On one level, he expected attention, admiration, and validation from those around him. On another, he resisted the effort required to achieve goals independently, seeking shortcuts or emotional leverage to secure what he wanted. This combination, desire without corresponding effort, is a hallmark of destructive entitlement. It strains relationships, breeds resentment, and can ultimately lead to emotional outbursts that escalate into violence when left unchecked. The Reiner family's experience is, in some ways, a cautionary tale about the pressures of fame intersecting with personal expectation. Parents often underestimate how the combination of privilege and legacy can shape a child's worldview. In Nick's case, love and support were abundant, yet they coexisted with resentment, frustration, and a perception of inadequacy. Entitlement became not just a behavioral pattern, but a lens through which he interpreted interactions, conflicts, and familial guidance. It's important to note that entitlement does not exist in isolation. It interacts with identity struggles, unresolved emotional trauma, and social pressure to create a complex psychological profile. Nick's resentment toward his father's prolific career in the shadow of Rob Reiner was not just envy. It was the emotional manifestation of a life in which he felt perpetually compared, undervalued, and trapped. The expectation to live up to a legacy he neither asked for nor felt equipped to embrace compounded his entitlement, creating a volatile emotional environment. The dynamic between Nick and his parents illustrates the delicate balance between guidance and autonomy. Rob and Michelle consistently attempted to provide structure, mentorship, and opportunities for self-expression, but entitlement has a way of eroding gratitude and perception. A child, or adult, who perceives love and effort as insufficient in meeting their expectations is primed for conflict. The tragic outcome in the Reiner household is, in part, a result of this erosion, a culmination of years in which entitlement collided with unresolved identity struggles. Even the public facade of the family could not contain the underlying tension. To outsiders, the Reiners represented accomplishment, stability, and creativity. But behind closed doors, the weight of expectation, both external and internal, amplified the challenges. Nick's sense of entitlement, juxtaposed against his parents' devotion and guidance, created a pressure cooker of emotion. Each perceived slight, unmet desire, or comparison to legacy acted as fuel to an already volatile situation. Psychologists often emphasize that entitlement, when coupled with emotional instability and unresolved family dynamics, can be a precursor to dangerous behavior. While many individuals with entitlement navigate life without causing harm, the combination of high stakes, personal frustration, and unaddressed psychological tension can manifest in destructive ways. In Nick's case, the intersection of these factors set the stage for the tragedy that would shock not only his family but the world at large. Moreover, entitlement feeds on expectation, creating a cycle of desire and disappointment. Nick expected recognition and love without effort, which intensified frustration when the world did not conform to his vision. His parents' attempts to provide support, guidance, and structure, while well-intentioned, were insufficient to disrupt this cycle.